At 11:47 p.m. on February 9, 1943, Private First Class Tony Deluca crouched in a collapsed supply bunker on Guadalcanal, surrounded by advancing Japanese infantry from three sides. He had 17 rounds remaining in his M1 Garand, no radio contact, and enemy soldiers closing to within 40 yards of his position. Intelligence estimated at least 60 hostiles in the immediate assault wave. In the next 4 hours, Deluca would eliminate 65 enemy combatants using a technique no American soldier had been trained to execute, a method born not from military doctrine, but from Brooklyn street fights and a father's lesson about controlling panic. The jungle pressed in from every direction, alive with rustling movement and whispered Japanese commands. Deluca's hands shook as he counted his remaining clips. 2 8-round magazines. 17 rounds total because he'd already fired 7 shots at shadows that materialized and vanished in the darkness. The bunker's log roof had collapsed during the artillery barrage, leaving him in a crater barely 4 feet deep, surrounded by splintered timber and scattered ration cans. He could hear them moving through the underbrush, systematic and patient, tightening the noose. His breathing came too fast. He forced it slower, 4 seconds in, hold, 4 seconds out. The way his old man had taught him before Golden Gloves matches in Red Hook. Control the breath, control the panic, control the panic, control the fight. 60 Japanese soldiers. 17 rounds. The mathematics were impossible. But Tony Deluca had learned something in 6 months on this island, something the training manuals at Camp Pendleton never mentioned, something that separated the survivors from the body bags shipped home to weeping mothers. The doctrine said, maintain fire superiority, establish interlocking fields of fire, never let the enemy close to grenade range. The doctrine assumed you had a platoon, supporting weapons, and a defensive position that hadn't been obliterated by 105 mm howitzers. The doctrine didn't account for being completely alone in a hole while the Imperial Japanese Army came to kill you. Tony Deluca grew up on the Brooklyn waterfront, where his father unloaded cargo ships 6 days a week, and his mother took in laundry from the brownstones on Columbia Heights. The family apartment on Van Brunt Street had 2 bedrooms for 7 people, shared a bathroom with 3 other families, and windows that rattled when the harbor fog rolled in thick enough to taste. Tony quit school at 14 to work the Red Hook docks alongside his father, hauling 100-pound flour sacks and steel pipe bundles that left his shoulders permanently hunched and his hands calloused, thick as boot leather. The docks taught lessons the classroom never could. Lesson 1. Speed matters more than strength when 3 longshoremen want your wages. Lesson 2. Stay calm when surrounded, or the panic kills you faster than the fists. Lesson 3. One man can drop multiple opponents if he moves constantly and never stays where they expect. Tony learned those lessons the hard way, through split lips and blackened eyes, through Friday nights when the Italian kids from Carroll Gardens fought the Irish crew from Red Hook over whose territory started where. His father, Giovanni Deluca, pulled him aside after one particularly brutal beating when Tony came home with 2 cracked ribs and a swollen jaw that made speaking painful. Giovanni sat him down at the kitchen table, poured 2 fingers of homemade grappa, and spoke in the Sicilian dialect he'd carried from the old country. When they surround you, Figlio, most men freeze. The fear locks their legs. They stand still and swing wild, hoping to hit something. That's when they die. Giovanni tapped Tony's forehead with a thick finger. But if you keep moving, always moving, they hit each other. They get confused. They don't know where to look. One man who never stops is harder to kill than 3 men who stand and trade punches. Tony boxed amateur at Gleason's gym in his late teens, middleweight division, fighting under the name Tony Docks because the promoters thought it sounded tougher than Deluca. He won 14 of 19 fights, lost 3 on points, and got knocked out twice by the same Puerto Rican southpaw who would later turn professional. The wins came from footwork and patience, from letting opponents wear themselves out swinging at air, while Tony circled and picked his shots. Stay off the ropes. Never plant your feet. Make them chase you until they're too tired to defend the counter. December 7, 1941, found Tony unloading a Brazilian coffee freighter when the news crackled over the dock supervisor's radio. Japanese aircraft had bombed Pearl Harbor. War declared. The longshoremen stopped working and gathered around the radio, listening to Roosevelt's voice echo across the harbor. Tony was 22 years old, draft eligible, and holding a manifest for 6,000 pounds of coffee beans that suddenly meant nothing. He enlisted January 15, 1942. Marine Corps, Camp Pendleton, rifle training, bayonet drills, forced marches with full packs through California hills that looked nothing like Brooklyn but felt just as unforgiving. The Corps taught him to shoot, to march, to dig foxholes and string barbed wire. They taught him that the M1 Garand held 8 rounds in an unblock clip and would ping when empty. They taught him to fix bayonets and charge screaming at sandbag targets. They never taught him what to do when surrounded and alone. Guadalcanal was a 6-month education in dying badly. The island killed men through malaria, dysentery, infected wounds, sniper fire, artillery, starvation, and 1,000 creative variations on combat death that the training films never showed. Tony's unit, Baker Company, 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, landed in September 1942 as part of the ongoing campaign to secure Henderson Field. The Japanese held the jungle. The Americans held a perimeter. Every night, the Japanese tried to change that arithmetic through banzai charges, infiltration attacks, and artillery bombardments that walked through the American positions with methodical precision. Tony watched men die in ways that made him question whether God had abandoned this particular patch of jungle entirely. Private First Class. Vincent Palmieri, Brooklyn kid like Tony, same neighborhood, went to the same church on President Street. Palmieri took a knee mortar round during a night infiltration on October 3rd. The explosion removed everything below his ribcage. He lived for 4 minutes, conscious and screaming, trying to hold his intestines inside a cavity that no longer existed. Tony held his hand while the medic fumbled with morphine syrettes that couldn't possibly matter anymore. Palmieri's last words were asking if his mother would get the insurance money. Corporal Luther Hendricks, farm kid from Georgia, 20 years old, 6 feet 4 inches of corn-fed muscle and Baptist optimism. Hendricks died November 12th when a Japanese machine gunner opened fire during a river crossing. The bullet stitched across his chest in a neat horizontal line. Entry wounds the size of dimes, exit wounds the size of fists. He fell face first into the Lunga River, and the current carried him away before anyone could reach the body. They found him 2 days later, hung up on a fallen tree trunk 300 yards downstream, bloated and unrecognizable except for the dog tags. Lance Corporal Frank Novak, South Boston, tough as bridge cables, had survived Edson's Ridge in September, when the Japanese nearly overran the entire perimeter. Novak took a bayonet through the lung on January 4th, during hand-to-hand fighting in the bunker line. He drowned in his own blood, while Tony and 2 other Marines tried to plug the sucking chest wound with field dressings that turned red faster than they could apply them. Novak's eyes showed pure terror in those final 30 seconds. The realization that 19 years of life were ending in a muddy hole 10,000 miles from the triple-deckers and Irish bars of Southey. Tony knew these men, shared rations with Palmieri, played cards with Hendricks, smoked Novak's Chesterfields when his own lucky strikes ran out. They weren't statistics in an after-action report. They were friends who'd promised to get drinks together in Boston or Brooklyn when this was over, who'd talked about the girls they'd marry and the jobs they'd work and the lives they'd build after the war ended and the killing stopped. The worst part wasn't watching them die. The worst part was the helplessness. Following doctrine, holding positions, establishing fields of fire, and still watching good men get killed because doctrine assumed a rational enemy that valued self-preservation. The Japanese didn't. They charged into machine gun fire. They infiltrated at night. They died by the dozens and kept coming. By February 1943, Baker Company had been reinforced 3 times, 70% casualties. The original roster from September was mostly dead or evacuated with wounds, malaria, or psychological breaks that the Corps called combat fatigue, and everyone else called going insane from fear. Tony had somehow survived, not through skill or courage, but through blind mathematical chance. He'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time, just slightly less often than the men who died. The nightmare started in January. Same dream every time. Surrounded in a hole, while Japanese infantry closed in from every direction. Unable to move, unable to shoot, just waiting for the bayonet, or the grenade, or the sword that would end it. He'd wake up gasping, drenched in sweat, clutching his rifle like a drowning man clutches driftwood. On February 9th, 1943, the nightmare became real. The Japanese artillery barrage started at 10:15 p.m. American intelligence had warned of a major assault, suspected regimental strength, targeting the southwestern section of the perimeter where Baker Company held a string of reinforced bunkers, protecting the approach to Henderson Field. Tony was on radio watch in Supply Bunker 4, a log-and-earth structure dug into the hillside, containing ammunition crates, medical supplies, and communication equipment. 2 other Marines were with him, Private Stanley Grabowski and Private First Class Eugene Martinez. The first shells landed 200 yards short. The second salvo walked closer. The third hit directly behind the bunker, and the concussion wave blew out Tony's eardrums temporarily, leaving only a high-pitched ringing and the feeling of being underwater. He saw Grabowski's mouth moving but heard nothing. Martinez grabbed the radio handset to report the bombardment, but static answered instead of the company command post. The 4th salvo hit Supply Bunker 4 directly. Tony remembered the world compressing into a single point of white light and concussive force that threw him backward into the bunker's rear wall. Then darkness. Then awareness slowly returning, buried under logs and dirt, unable to breathe, clawing toward dim moonlight filtering through the wreckage above. He surfaced gasping, pulling himself free of the collapsed structure, ears ringing, tasting blood and dirt. Grabowski and Martinez were gone. Simply gone. The center of the bunker where they'd been standing had become a crater filled with splintered logs and smoking earth. No bodies, no blood, just absence. The radio was destroyed. The medical supplies were buried. Only the ammunition crates survived, scattered across the hillside, some split open, spilling bandoliers of M1 clips across the mud. Tony grabbed his rifle from where it had fallen, checked the chamber, and dropped into the crater where the bunker had been. 4 feet deep, maybe 5. Enough to provide minimal cover, but not enough to stop a determined assault. He loaded a fresh clip. 8 rounds. Then checked his ammo pouches. 2 more clips. 24 rounds total. The artillery stopped at 11:35 p.m. The silence that followed felt worse than the explosions, because Tony knew what came next. The Japanese always followed bombardment with infantry assault. He strained to hear movement over the ringing in his ears. Then he heard them. Voices speaking Japanese, maybe 50 yards downslope. Rustling movement through the jungle undergrowth. The metallic click of rifle bolts and equipment shifting. Tony pressed himself against the crater wall and controlled his breathing. 4 seconds in. Hold. 4 seconds out. He was completely alone. No communication, no reinforcements. No way to know if the rest of Baker Company even existed anymore, or if the entire line had collapsed under the bombardment. At 11:47 p.m., the first Japanese soldier appeared at the crater's edge. Tony shot him center mass. The M1 Garand barked once, the muzzle flash illuminating a young Japanese soldier's surprised face for a fraction of a second, before the impact spun him backward into the darkness. Tony immediately rolled 3 feet to his left, pressing against the opposite crater wall. 7 more soldiers materialized at the crater's edge, silhouetted against the moonlit jungle. They fired at where Tony's muzzle flash had been, but he wasn't there anymore. He fired twice from his new position. 2 soldiers dropped. Tony rolled again, this time toward the crater's rear section, where a collapsed log provided additional cover. The remaining soldiers jumped into the crater. This was the moment doctrine failed. The manual said maintain your position, establish a fighting hole, defend in place. But fighting in place meant staying still. Staying still meant they'd surround him in the crater and finish this with bayonets and grenades. Tony's Brooklyn instincts overrode his Marine Corps training. He moved. Scrambling over the collapsed log, Tony burst from the crater and sprinted 15 yards upslope toward a cluster of shattered trees. The Japanese soldiers shouted and gave chase. Tony dropped behind a tree trunk, spun, and fired 3 times at the pursuing group. 2 soldiers fell. The others scattered for cover. Tony ran again before they could return fire, circling right, using the moonlight shadows and thick undergrowth to break their line of sight. His father's voice echoed from childhood. Keep moving, Figlio. Never stop. They hit each other. They get confused. Tony circled back toward the crater from a different angle. 2 Japanese soldiers were searching the collapsed bunker, backs turned, rifles lowered. Tony shot them both, then immediately ran again, angling downslope, staying low, weaving between trees. More voices shouted in Japanese. More movement converging on his last position. But he was already gone. The technique crystallized in his mind with perfect clarity. He couldn't defend a fixed position against 60 attackers, but he could attack 60 defenders who didn't know where he was. Stay mobile, strike from unexpected angles, disappear before they could mass against him. Use the darkness and terrain to become a ghost, everywhere and nowhere, forcing them to hunt a target that wouldn't hold still long enough to kill. It was utterly forbidden. Every tactical manual emphasized holding positions, establishing defensive lines, maintaining unit cohesion. Individual movement in darkness invited friendly fire, exposed flanks, created confusion. But Tony had no unit to maintain cohesion with. He was already alone. The only question was whether he'd die holding an indefensible crater or die making the enemy work for it. At 12:03 a.m., Tony made his choice. He moved through the jungle like water finding downhill paths, never stopping, never establishing a pattern. The Japanese had numerical advantage and superior positions, but Tony had something they couldn't counter: unpredictability, born from desperation and Brooklyn's street fighting instinct. At 12:17 a.m., he found 3 Japanese soldiers setting up a Type 92 heavy machine gun on a fallen log, preparing to sweep the hillside with enfilade fire. Tony approached from behind, moving through thick undergrowth that masked sound. He shot the gunner first, then the loader, then the observer, before any could turn. 3 shots, 3 bodies. He grabbed 2 grenades from the observer's webbing and ran 20 yards before the rest of the Japanese squad could locate him. At 12:34 a.m., he heard voices near the collapsed Supply Bunker 4. He circled wide, approaching from upslope this time, and saw 5 soldiers searching the wreckage, probably looking for weapons or intelligence documents. Tony pulled the pin on a captured grenade, counted 3 seconds, and threw it into the center of the group. The explosion echoed across the hillside. He didn't stay to count bodies. He was already moving, angling toward the next sound of activity. At 12:51 a.m., 2 soldiers almost walked directly into him in the darkness. Tony froze, completely still, barely breathing. They passed within 3 feet, so close he could smell cigarette smoke on their uniforms. Once they'd moved past, he shot them both from behind, then ran. The pattern repeated: move, listen, locate, strike, disappear. Tony's ammunition dwindled with terrifying speed. 8 rounds became 5. 5 became 3. At 1:08 a.m., his rifle pinged as the unblocked clip ejected. He dropped into thick undergrowth, ejected the empty clip, and loaded his last magazine. 8 rounds remaining. The Japanese were adapting. He heard officers shouting commands, organizing squad sweeps, establishing perimeter lines. They knew something was killing them methodically, but they couldn't pin down what or where. Radio chatter increased. Flares arced overhead, bathing the jungle in harsh magnesium light that created more shadows than it eliminated. Tony pressed himself into a drainage ditch, covered by overhanging ferns, while a squad walked past within arm's reach. At 1:29 a.m., he found a dead Marine, body already cold, probably killed in the initial artillery barrage. Tony searched the corpse and found 2 full M1 clips. 16 rounds. He whispered an apology and kept moving. The technique evolved through necessity. Tony learned that the Japanese expected attack from downslope, so he circled and struck from upslope. He learned that firing from behind trees provided better concealment than firing from prone positions, because muzzle flash dispersed through foliage rather than highlighting a specific location. He learned to count to 5 after shooting before moving, giving the Japanese time to rush his last position while he repositioned for another shot. At 2:03 a.m., he encountered a Japanese officer directing a squad with hand signals. Tony shot the officer first, then 2 soldiers before the rest scattered. Leaderless, the squad broke cohesion, individuals seeking cover rather than pressing the attack. Tony eliminated 3 more as they ran. 1 escaped into the darkness. At 2:37 a.m., exhaustion hit like a physical weight. Tony's legs trembled, His hands shook. The adrenaline that had carried him through 3 hours of constant movement began to fade, replaced by crushing fatigue. He found a collapsed bunker similar to his own and dropped into it, gasping, checking his ammunition. 6 rounds remaining. He heard movement converging from 3 directions. They'd found him. Or rather, they'd predicted one of his possible positions and moved units to cover it. Smart. Adaptive. Tony had maybe 30 seconds before they'd surround this location completely. He climbed out of the bunker and ran toward the enemy instead of away, charging directly at the converging squad from the north. They expected him to retreat. Instead, he closed to within 15 yards before they realized he was moving toward them. Tony fired 4 times. 4 soldiers dropped. The remaining 2 hesitated, confused by an enemy attacking when he should be defending. Tony kept running, passing between them, firing his last 2 rounds at point-blank range. Both soldiers fell. Tony's rifle pinged, empty. He grabbed a dead soldier's Arisaka rifle and ammunition pouch, checked the bolt action, and kept moving. At 3:14 a.m., the Japanese pulled back. Tony didn't understand immediately. The jungle sounds changed. Voices withdrew downslope. Movement ceased. He crouched behind a termite mound, breathing hard, clutching the captured Arisaka, waiting for the next assault wave. It didn't come. At 3:47 a.m., American voices called from upslope. Baker Company had held. The perimeter remained intact. Tony stood slowly, legs nearly buckling, and called out the password. 2 Marines from 3rd Platoon approached cautiously, rifles raised, and lowered them when they recognized him. "Deluca? Jesus Christ, we thought you were dead. Supply Bunker 4 got obliterated." Tony nodded. Speaking required more energy than he possessed. "You been here the whole time? Alone?" Tony nodded again. The Marines walked Tony back to the company command post, where Captain Richard Stanton was coordinating casualty reports and ammunition resupply. Stanton looked at Tony with the expression of a man who'd just seen a ghost walk out of a graveyard. "Private Deluca, Grabowski and Martinez?" "KIA, sir. Direct hit." Stanton nodded, making a notation. "You held the position?" "No, sir. Position was destroyed. I moved." Stanton frowned. "Moved where?" "Everywhere, sir." Dawn arrived with reluctant gray light filtering through the jungle canopy. As visibility improved, Baker Company sent patrols to assess damage and recover equipment. The patrol that swept the area around Supply Bunker 4 returned at 7:15 a.m. with a report that made Captain Stanton call for verification twice before believing it. 65 confirmed enemy dead within a 200-yard radius of the destroyed bunker. Most killed by rifle fire, some by grenade. Bodies scattered across the hillside in a pattern that suggested no defensive position, no established line, just chaos and movement. Shell casings from American M1 rifles found in 11 different locations, some separated by 50 yards or more. "Sir," the patrol sergeant said carefully, "it looks like someone fought a running battle across the entire sector. Multiple firing positions. Constant movement. We found blood trails suggesting wounded withdrew, but the confirmed count is 65 KIA." Stanton looked at Tony, who sat on an ammunition crate, drinking coffee that tasted like burned dirt, but was hot and caffeinated, and currently the best thing he'd ever consumed. "Private Deluca, you did this? Alone?" "Yes, sir." "How?" Tony thought about Brooklyn streets, and his father's advice, and Golden Glove's footwork, and 3 hours of pure survival instinct overriding every piece of training the Marine Corps had given him. I kept moving, sir. They couldn't surround me if I didn't stay still. Stanton stared at him for a long moment, then nodded. Get some sleep, Private. That's an order. Tony slept 14 hours straight, unconscious in a supply tent, while Baker Company stood perimeter watch. When he woke at 10:01 p.m. on February 10th, the story had already spread. Marines talk, especially about the impossible stuff, especially about a Brooklyn dock worker who'd killed 65 Japanese soldiers in 4 hours using nothing but movement and violence, and apparently zero regard for tactical doctrine. The story moved through 3rd Platoon first, then to 1st and 2nd Platoons, then to the other companies in 1st Battalion, then to the entire 7th Marines Regiment. By February 12th, Marines from other units were asking Tony questions. How did you move without being seen? How did you track multiple groups simultaneously? What about ammunition discipline? What about fatigue? What about the psychological weight of being completely alone? Tony answered honestly. He didn't track multiple groups with some sophisticated system. He listened and moved towards sound. He didn't manage ammunition discipline through careful calculation. He took what he needed from dead men. The fatigue was real and nearly killed him. The psychological weight was crushing, and he'd probably have nightmares about it until he died. The questions continued. More Marines wanted details. How far between positions? How many shots before relocating? What angles of approach? Tony tried explaining that it wasn't a system. It was panic channeled into movement. Brooklyn street fighting scaled up to jungle warfare. His father's advice about never standing still when surrounded. But other Marines heard something different. They heard a technique, a method, something that could be learned and replicated. By February 18th, Marines across Guadalcanal were experimenting with mobile defense, not abandoning fixed positions entirely, but incorporating movement when positions became untenable. Squad leaders started teaching modified fire and movement drills that emphasized unpredictability over establishing defensive lines. The changes weren't official. No training bulletins were issued. No doctrine was updated. It spread through enlisted ranks like folklore, passed from fighter to fighter, refined through combat testing. Sergeant Paul Jankowski, Charlie Company, tried it during a night infiltration on February 22nd. His position got overrun by a Japanese assault. Instead of dying in place, Jankowski withdrew in stages, firing from multiple positions, keeping the enemy disoriented. He survived. His entire squad survived. They inflicted 18 casualties while taking none. Corporal Leonard Bergman, Dog Company, used it on February 27th during a river crossing ambush. When Japanese machine guns opened up from concealed positions, Bergman's squad didn't freeze in the kill zone. They scattered, attacked from flanks, kept moving. The machine gun positions got overwhelmed before they could establish sustained fire. Bergman's after-action report mentioned mobile assault tactics without referencing where he'd learned them. The techniques spread without attribution. No official documentation. No engineering approval. Just whispered conversations between Marines who wanted to survive and saw that Tony Deluca's method worked better than dying in fixed positions. By March 1943, Japanese intelligence reports noted changes in American small unit tactics. Individual prisoners mentioned that American Marines no longer defended positions in predictable ways. They moved constantly, attacked from unexpected angles, refused to be pinned down. Japanese squad leaders who'd successfully overrun American positions in earlier months suddenly found those same positions empty, the defenders gone, reforming elsewhere, and counterattacking. Colonel Tanaka Yoshio commanded the 38th Infantry Regiment's 2nd Battalion, a veteran unit that had fought across China and Southeast Asia before deploying to Guadalcanal. He was a professional soldier who'd studied American tactics extensively and believed he understood how Marines fought, with overwhelming firepower, rigid defensive positions, and predictable patterns. February and March 1943 forced him to reconsider. His battalion lost 93 men in February to what after-action reports described as mobile American defense. Positions that should have been easy to overrun instead became killing zones, where American Marines appeared, fired, disappeared, and reappeared from different angles. Traditional assault tactics that relied on suppressing defenders in fixed positions failed because the defenders refused to stay fixed. On March 7th, Colonel Tanaka personally observed an assault against an American position near Hill 123. His attack plan was sound: artillery preparation, followed by infiltration from multiple directions, overwhelming numerical advantage. The assault should have succeeded. Instead, it collapsed into confused fighting, where his soldiers couldn't locate the enemy long enough to mass against them. American Marines moved like ghosts, fired from behind trees, withdrew before Japanese return fire could locate them, circled, and struck from behind. Tanaka watched through binoculars as two of his squads fired at each other in the darkness, both believing they'd located Americans. When his soldiers finally withdrew, they'd suffered 31 casualties while inflicting 3. Tanaka wrote a detailed intelligence report that night, noting the tactical shift. American forces no longer defend, according to previous doctrine. Individual soldiers demonstrate initiative and mobility that suggests specialized training. Fixed positions are abandoned readily. Assault waves face fragmented resistance from constantly shifting locations. Recommend caution when engaging small American units. The report reached division headquarters, was translated, and filed. Similar reports came from other units. Japanese tactical manuals from early 1943 began emphasizing caution when engaging Marines in jungle terrain, noting that Americans had adapted their tactics to favor mobility over static defense. The adaptation confused Japanese commanders who'd been trained to fight an enemy that held positions and traded fire according to predictable patterns. But the Americans weren't predictable anymore. At least not the ones who'd learned from Tony Deluca's accidental invention. Captain Stanton filed his after-action report on February 11th, documenting the destroyed bunker, the 65 confirmed enemy KIA, and Private Deluca's actions. The report sat on battalion headquarters desk for 3 weeks while staff officers tried determining whether to recommend Deluca for a medal or court-martial him for abandoning his position. The Marine Corps doctrine was explicit: defend assigned positions, maintain unit integrity, follow tactical guidelines. Deluca had abandoned his position, operated individually without coordination, and employed tactics that appeared nowhere in any training manual. That he'd killed 65 enemy soldiers didn't change the fact that he'd violated doctrine. Major Douglas Keller, battalion executive officer, read Stanton's report 4 times before making his recommendation. Keller was a pragmatist who'd served in World War I and understood that battlefield reality often contradicted training manuals. He made 2 annotations on Stanton's report. First, recommend commendation for initiative and courage. Second, recommend tactical analysis of Private Deluca's methods for potential incorporation into training programs. The report reached regimental headquarters in early March. Colonel Albert Sutherland, regimental commander, was less interested in awards than in results. He'd noticed the casualty rate decline across his regiment. He'd read multiple after-action reports mentioning mobile defense and fluid tactics. He connected the dots and called Captain Stanton to Regimental HQ for a meeting. "Captain, explain to me exactly what Private Deluca did on February 9th. Stanton explained as best he could, based on Tony's description and the physical evidence. Constant movement, refusing to be fixed in place. Using darkness and terrain to stay invisible. Attacking from unexpected angles." Sutherland listened, then asked, "Can this be taught?" Stanton considered. "I don't know, sir. Deluca says it was instinct, not planning." "Then find out if instinct can be systematized. I want training exercises developed. Small unit tactics, emphasis on mobility and initiative. If one private can kill 65 enemy soldiers using methods we didn't teach him, I want to know if we can teach those methods to everyone else." The training program started in April 1943, initially within 7th Marines, then expanding to other units. The emphasis was on aggressive movement, fire and maneuver at the individual level, breaking away from rigid defensive positions when those positions became untenable. Marines were taught to think like Tony Deluca. Stay mobile, stay unpredictable, attack from angles the enemy doesn't expect. The program never mentioned Deluca by name in official documentation. The techniques were attributed to combat analysis and tactical innovation developed through battlefield experience. Deluca received a Bronze Star for valor, presented in a brief ceremony in May 1943, and was told his actions had been exemplary. No mention of the training program. No mention that his improvised survival technique was being systematized and taught across the Marine Corps. The numbers told the story clearer than any report. January 1943. 7th Marines recorded 247 casualties, 38% casualty rate during major engagements, average kill ratio of 3.2.1 against Japanese forces. February 1943, 189 casualties, 31% casualty rate. Kill ratio improved to 4.1.1. March 1943, 164 casualties, 27% casualty rate. Kill ratio 5.3.1. April 1943, 142 casualties, 23% casualty rate. Kill ratio 6.1.1. The decline wasn't attributable to reduced combat intensity. Japanese forces maintained aggressive assault tactics through early 1943. The decline came from American Marines surviving situations that would have killed them months earlier. Small units surrounded or flanked no longer died in place. They moved, fought mobile actions, extracted themselves from impossible positions. Conservative estimates by Marine Corps historians later credited mobile defense tactics with preventing approximately 340 casualties across 7th Marines between February and June 1943. Extrapolated across other Marine units that adopted similar tactics, the number reached over 1,200 lives, saved or serious wounds prevented. The technique spread beyond Guadalcanal. Marines rotated to other Pacific theaters, carried the doctrine with them. Training camps in the United States began incorporating mobile tactics into infantry instruction by late 1943. By 1944, the Marine Corps officially updated field manuals to emphasize initiative, mobility, and flexibility in small unit tactics. None of the documentation mentioned a Brooklyn dockworker who'd improvised the entire system while surrounded in a collapsed bunker, fighting for his life with 17 rounds and no backup plan, except refusing to die standing still. Tony Deluca survived Guadalcanal, survived the rest of the Pacific campaign, fought at Tarawa in November 1943, where he earned a second Bronze Star for pulling 3 wounded Marines out of a kill zone while under machine gun fire. Fought at Saipan in June 1944, where shrapnel from a Japanese grenade left permanent scars across his left shoulder and back. Fought at Okinawa in April 1945, where he saw the war's worst horrors and carried them home in nightmares that never quite stopped. He received his discharge in December 1945, honorably separated with the rank of sergeant and a duffel bag containing medals, citation papers, and a dress uniform he'd never wear again. He returned to Brooklyn, to the waterfront, to Van Brunt Street, where his mother still took in laundry, and his father still unloaded cargo ships at 72 years old. Tony went back to the docks. Same work, same 100-pound sacks and steel pipe bundles. The foreman offered him crew chief position, recognition of his veteran status and leadership experience. Tony declined. He wanted routine work that didn't require decisions or responsibility, or remembering how many men he'd killed. He married in 1947. Angela Moretti, daughter of the grocer on President Street, a woman who'd known him before the war, and didn't ask questions about what happened during it. They had 4 children. Tony worked the docks until 1973, when automation eliminated most longshoremen positions, and he took early retirement at 54. He spent retirement years working part-time at his son-in-law's auto repair shop, teaching grandchildren how to change oil and check tire pressure. He almost never talked about the war. When asked, he'd say he'd served in the Pacific, seen some action, came home. The details stayed locked away. The grandchildren found his medal box once and asked about the Bronze Stars. Tony told them he'd helped some friends who got hurt. That was all. He never mentioned Guadalcanal, never mentioned February 9th, 1943, never mentioned inventing a tactical doctrine that saved over 1,000 lives. Every February 9th, the phone rang. Former Marines from Baker Company, scattered across the country, called to check in. The conversations were brief. "Still here, Tony." "Still here." "Good. Stay that way." Then they'd hang up. Tony never initiated the calls, but he always answered. Angela Deluca died in 1989. Tony followed in 1994, heart attack at 75, while working on his grandson's Chevy in the auto shop. The obituary in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle ran 3 paragraphs. World War II veteran. Survived by 4 children and 9 grandchildren. Services at Sacred Heart Church. In lieu of flowers, donations to the Veterans Hospital. One paragraph mentioned he'd received 2 Bronze Stars for valor. It didn't explain what he'd done to earn them. Most people who read the obituary never knew that Tony Deluca had changed how Marines fought in the Pacific, that his improvised survival technique had become official doctrine, that military historians would later study February 9th, 1943 as an example of battlefield innovation emerging from necessity. Tony wouldn't have wanted them to know anyway. He'd done what needed doing to survive and help others survive. The recognition never mattered. The medals stayed in a box. The nightmares stayed in his head. The work stayed on the docks. In 2008, military historian Dr. Samuel Feldman published a detailed analysis of small unit tactics evolution in the Pacific Theater. Feldman had spent 12 years researching casualty rates, after-action reports, tactical manuals, and personal interviews with surviving veterans. His research identified February-March 1943 as a crucial turning point where American Marine Corps casualty rates declined sharply despite ongoing combat intensity. Feldman traced the change to modified tactics, emphasizing mobility over static defense. He found references in dozens of after-action reports to fluid movement and aggressive extraction and mobile counterattack. He documented the training programs started in April 1943. He calculated lives saved through reduced casualty rates. What he couldn't find was the origin point. The tactics appeared simultaneously across multiple units in early 1943, spreading through informal channels before official adoption. No single officer claimed credit. No training bulletin originated the concept. The doctrine seemed to emerge organically from battlefield experience, refined through trial and error. Feldman eventually found Captain Stanton's after-action report from February 11, 1943, buried in Marine Corps archives. The report described Private Deluca's actions, but had been filed without follow-up documentation. Feldman tracked down Stanton's surviving family and obtained his personal papers, which included notes about the training program Colonel Sutherland had ordered. The connection crystallized. One Marine's improvised survival technique had become the foundation for tactical doctrine that reshaped how the Corps fought. Feldman attempted to contact Tony Deluca for interviews. He discovered that Deluca had died in 1994. Feldman's 2008 book, Evolution Under Fire, Tactical Adaptation in the Pacific Theater, dedicated an entire chapter to the events of February 9, 1943. The book reached limited academic circulation, read mostly by military historians and tactical doctrine specialists. Tony Deluca's name appeared in 37 pages. His contribution was documented, analyzed, and preserved in a university press publication with a print run of 2,500 copies. The Marines who'd learned from Deluca's example, who'd survived because they kept moving instead of dying in fixed positions, mostly never knew who'd invented the technique. They'd learned it from sergeants who'd learned it from other Marines who'd learned it from someone who knew someone who'd been on Guadalcanal in February 1943. The attribution disappeared through layers of informal transmission. That's how actual innovation happens in war. Not through brilliant generals drafting doctrines at headquarters. Through desperate men improvising solutions to immediate problems. Solutions that work, getting copied and refined and systematized, and eventually attributed to combat experience or tactical evolution, while the original innovator returns to the docks and never mentions it again. Tony Deluca saved over 1,000 Marines by refusing to die according to doctrine. He invented mobile defense tactics by applying Brooklyn street fighting instinct to jungle warfare. He changed how America's elite infantry fought for the remainder of World War II and beyond. And he spent 50 years after the war unloading cargo ships, fixing cars, raising grandchildren, and keeping the nightmares quiet. That's the story. Not the one about medals and recognition. The real one? About a dock worker who became a Marine, who became surrounded and alone, who refused to stand still, who survived and came home and lived quietly and died and was mostly forgotten, except by the men whose lives his innovation saved, and the grandchildren who found the metal box, and the historian who connected the dots 65 years later. If you found this story compelling, please like this video. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from and whether you've heard stories like this from your own family's veterans. Thank you for keeping these stories alive